So welcome, and I am going to jump right into share my screen, and because we have a lot of material to cover today. And as I was preparing this, I was thinking about how Linda said that I put a lot into a talk. So just to give you the heads up that a lot of this material is in that article from 0 to 3 that I sent you, as well as in the recommended reading, The Developmental Science of Early Childhood. So don't be alarmed. And just as a review, these are the core concepts that we're really trying to integrate. And you'll see as we go along that there's so much overlap in all of these concepts, which is again the reason for the circle or the flower. And today we're going to talk both about safety and how relationships change the brain. And they're really actually very related topics. We talked on the first day about meaning making and how we make meaning of our experience in the world. And the autonomic nervous system is really a frontline meaning making system. And I'm going to delve into what I mean by that and give you a very brief introduction to something called the polyvagal theory developed by neuroscientist Stephen Porges, which is certainly learning about it changed the way I understand my clinical work as well as development. So this is it in a nutshell. I think it used to be kind of taught that there were two ways that our bodies could respond to the environment. There's one that's controlled by what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, which is where we can look into another person's eyes. We have this kind of nice, the way I'm talking with you, prosody of the voice. Our facial muscles are very expressive. And we can receive a hug. We're open for connection. And then there's the sympathetic nervous system, which is what controls what many of you are probably familiar with as the fight-flight response, which is that when confronted with a fearful stimulus, our body goes under the influence of the sympathetic nervous system, either fights or runs away. So it mobilizes. So what Stephen Porges identified, and this was actually rooted in his work with premature babies, is that there's another branch of the parasympathetic nervous system, what he calls the primitive vagus. And that's what's activated when we sense overwhelming threat. So that's the kind of classic mouse in the jaws of a cat. So when we are overwhelmingly threatened, our facial muscles become flat, our muscle tone is low, we become still. Okay, I am going to, somebody is asked to be admitted whose name I do not recognize. So hang on one second. Maybe somebody has not named themselves.
I wonder if it's Barb. Barb Worley is away. She might be using her friend's phone to get in or something. Maybe it's Barb. Barbara Worley is not on yet.
Okay,
and I know
so
she's
I admitted them, and then we'll see who it is. Said David Brown.
Yeah, that's going to be Barb.
Oh, okay, terrific. So let me go back to sharing my screen.
And Claudia, I will let anybody else in if you'd like to, so you don't have to stop, because I know Louise is probably going to come in. I'll watch.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. Okay. Okay, so why is this important? This is the way we make meaning of, assess the safety of our environment and how the sort of frontline meaning making system. And I think to make it, I'm going to just share a very brief clinical vignette because it brings the concept to life. So I was working with a girl who was referred for very restrictive eating behavior, which is kind of a bread and butter concern that comes to pediatricians. And I got the history that she she was premature, had serious medical illness throughout her first year of life, although she was really a robust, healthy little girl. And I saw her on Zoom. It was just a delight to be with her. She was like running around with the phone. It was really challenging my vestibular system. We were having a really good time. And I tried to encourage her parents not to talk to her about food, because clearly they were very focused on food. But at one point, the conversation veered into food. It was actually, we were talking about her digestive system, and her mother said to her, you used to eat apricots. Why don't you eat apricots anymore? And all of a sudden, there on her face was the primitive vagus. She stopped moving. The facial muscles became still. Her whole body froze. And what we learned so then here we were in the visit, I could say, hey, what is that? And they described, this is what she does when they talk about food. And it turned out that really she was holding her parents' terror, where they had had this feeling that she was going to die any moment for the first year of her life. And they had never really talked about it or processed it in any way. So here all of that fear got displaced onto the behavior of eating. And then she reflected it back to them by showing the primitive vagus, that sense of threat, in her face and in her body. And it was, once we were able to kind of take notice of it and talk about it, it really resulted in a tremendous shift in the whole family. So clinically, in our work, why is this important? So there's some situations where fight flight is not an option. So parenting, where often parents are very much triggered by their child's behavior or child's acting out. I was just doing supervision with someone, and she was telling me about a mom who had experienced a very violent rape. And then whenever her 3-year-old would just, in a very typical 3-year-old way, kick her unintentionally, she would feel this tremendous jolt of terror in her body. But when you're parenting, even though you may be triggered by your child's behavior, ideally you're not going to hit your child or abandon your child. So the only option available then is to dissociate. And that's how the still face kind of overlaps with the polyvagal theory. And then the other situation is when in our work. So if you look at this mom, I mean, I just took this off of Google Images, but you can see that she's with her child in the therapist office, and you can see that kind of still face there. And when you're under the influence of the primitive vagus, not only are you not lacking in that kind of ability for social connection, but even the muscles of the middle ear are not functioning well. So it's just very difficult to take in information. Stephen Porges coined this term neuroception, which is different from the conscious process of perception. It's the way our autonomic nervous system makes meaning of a situation as safe. And then this is just to quote Steve Porges: if you are near a person who is engaging, smiling, using prosody, the intonation of voice, you may feel safe and want to be closer to that person. You'll realize that background sounds disappear. You become interested and your body state becomes calm. That's neuroception of safety being triggered by the other person's social engagement system. So this social engagement system is really a critical part of our biology, because it regulates our physiology, our blood pressure. It protects against the harmful effects of stress. And this is another Porges original. He calls it our own personal TSA agent. So I think I mentioned this at the end of my talk last week, that this idea that the feeling of safety is the treatment. So if we go back to that circle, here we go. Oh, that was perfect timing. You know, these are all interrelated concepts, but if I had to put something first, I would say that the sense of safety is first, because you can't really do anything else. If you're frozen and you're feeling like you're dissociated, you're not present, then you can't really take advantage of the connection with the person who's working with you, in relationship with you. So that's why in this listening flower, I put time and space for listening as the center. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the core of what today's lecture was scheduled for, which is this idea of relationships changing the brain. Now, some people put this lecture at the beginning, that this looking at the brain, what happens in the brain is really primary. And I find it to be really an interesting thing that there's something somehow more real if you see the change in the brain than if you just see the change in the person, which is, it's just a curious thing just to take note of. And I'm going to just go over these 3 different categories of ways in which relationships change the brain. And these are, when we get to the end of this talk, before our guests arrive, I'm going to, and even after they leave, I'm just putting out some questions that I want you to be thinking about as I'm talking. First of all, I'm curious about how this knowledge, I'm basically just giving you information. How does this affect the way we work with families? And does just an understanding of the stress response system impact on our day-to-day work with families? And the same thing with the concept of epigenetics. And I'm going to conclude, I hope, tying this all together in this concept of belonging that we can discuss at the conclusion. So just keep those in mind. Okay, so I just wanted to put this up there because you can see my orientation, that I think information is great, but there is some limit to information. And I found this to be a very interesting finding. In 2017, there was a national survey of parents done by 0 to 3, where they found that parents don't know how deeply infants can be affected by them in the first months of life. So, but the majority of parents said the information is both motivating and terrifying, with 35% equally or more terrified than motivated. So this is just a kind of caution to be careful with how we use this information. So having said that, this is a term I've used, certainly is used a lot, this idea that caregivers are neuroarchitects, and that is in the moment by moment relationship between caregiver and an infant that the child's brain is actually built. And this is a video from the Center on the Developing Child.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
So I don't know about you, but I can see why that might be terrifying to a parent. If they're thinking, especially a parent who doesn't really have the kind of holding environment, the kind of network of support that many parents in our world today don't have. So just again, to keep that in mind, but I think it's helpful for us to realize how important it is to do what we're talking about here. So I'm going to give you kind of a schematic overview of brain development, and it's actually much more complicated than this, but I think holding this kind of imagery in your mind can be very useful. So some sort of critical structures, the medial prefrontal cortex, also known as, which I'm going to talk about more, the observing brain, the amygdala, and the insula, that I'm going to talk about, that Melanie mentioned also in her talk, as well as the hypothalamus. So just basic structures that are important, and I'm going to tell you how they're important. So again, this is kind of a broad view of the subject. It's more granular and complex than this, but I think it's sufficient to give you a feeling of what we're talking about, that this part of the brain, which is not really online at all at birth and develops even into a person's 20s, is primarily responsible for emotional regulation. It's a way we can, it's, as I said, called the observing brain, where we see and observe what we're experiencing. And we can, when that part of the brain is well developed, then you can have big feelings. I mean, big feelings are not bad things, but you can have them and not become disorganized. And you can see that the medial prefrontal cortex actually wraps around the amygdala, which is fully developed at birth, and is Bessel van der Kolk calls it the smoke alarm of the brain. It's responsible for processing what we were talking about earlier, anxiety and terror and feelings of terror, thus the smoke alarm. So then the hypothalamus, the amygdala through the hypothalamus connects with the glands responsible for releasing stress hormones, such as adrenaline and cortisol. So these are the hormones that give us the physical sensation of stress. And play a big role in just normal day-to-day stress, as well as what I referred to earlier as the fight-flight response. So as I've said this to you already about the MPC regulating the smoke alarm. So then the insula is another important part of the brain. And I love the way Melanie was right, a kind of parallel with the way I think about the insula, because it connects with the visceral organs of the body. So it's kind of the way you literally feel another person's feelings. So you've probably had the experience of being with another person, whether in a personal setting or as a clinician, where there's something very moving that happens between you, and that you'll literally feel that tingling, where you have this kind of profound connection with another person. What we call empathy, actually, but you physically feel it. You feel this kind of tingling in your arms, your eyes well up with tears. So it's really kind of literally, as I said, feeling what another person is feeling. And then another important part of the brain are mirror neurons, which were first discovered in the early 1990s, where you mirror they're activated when you're watching a person doing something. So they're thought to code for not only the person's actions, but the intention of their actions. So again, play a critical role in being able to understand the perspective of another person. When these connections are not well developed, then a person is very easily thrown into a state of disorganization. And you can see a lot of this overlaps with what I spoke about last week with Bruce Perry's model with the upside down triangle of the brain. So when there's been disorganization in relationships early on in life, these connections that hug the amygdala are not well developed, and a person is very easily thrown into disorganization and not able to access the higher cortical centers when they're under extreme stress. Referring back, as you can see, all of these things are very much interconnected, because last week I also talked about this idea of reflective functioning. And when a caregiver is curious about what is the meaning of a child's behavior, and really, in that term that I referred to, holds their child in mind, that's really how these parts of the brain develop in that kind of experience of being seen by a caregiver. Okay. So I also talked in the first talk about moments of meeting, and Beatrice Beebe describes a moment of meeting as a match between how one knows oneself and how one is known. And so I think of this being seen, this thinking of how the medial prefrontal cortex is growing in these moments where the baby feels seen by their caregiver. This photo is a little bit dark, but this is a still from the NBO that I showed you in the opening lecture, but you can see how their gaze is meeting, and that mother is really seeing that baby as himself. And so you can imagine that his little medial prefrontal cortex is firing over his little amygdala while he's having this experience. Again, this is somewhat metaphoric, but I think it holds. Okay, so another way in which relationships change the brain is in the interface. Somebody has their, if you could all mute yourselves, please, because I hear some background noise. Thank you. This could be a whole talk in of itself, but the immune system, the nervous system, and the endocrine system are very much interrelated. So it's not just the nervous system that makes meaning in relationships, but the immune system and the endocrine system. And sort of a classic, we have this example in our book, The Power of Discord. So a child is in with a high level of creativity, is in a school setting where they're asked to sit at a desk, and you might see that child develop a flare of eczema, inflammation of the skin. And that might represent where the child is not able to say, this is beyond my ability to cope, but the body reacts to a situation that it's beyond its ability to cope by activating the immune system, which leads to the flare-up of eczema. And then the stress response system, which we've talked about a bit, is a really important thing in our lives, because stress happens all the time. And we need to be able to experience stress and then reset ourselves. And actually, its transient increases in stress hormone are protective and essential for survival. But as Dr. Tronick explained, it's when you have these prolonged unrepaired mismatch that you're bathed in stress hormones in a way that's actually harmful to not only the brain, but all organs of the body. Okay, I'm going to just stop sharing because I'm going to go on to kind of another subject here. I want to see all your beautiful faces for a moment. and see if anybody has any questions or comments about that material. Yes, Kelsey.
I was just thinking about a little one that that I had worked with, and he had or has you know, significant like eczema and allergy responses, and I just wonder if sometimes the presence of those things should prompt us to kind of backtrack and look at, you know, instead of saying like that example was like difficulty in coping and then eczema resulted, but if the child comes to us with these things existing, we probably should get in the habit of saying like what might be happening that is overwhelming him.
Yes, and that actually links back to what I don't talk about a lot, but is very much out there in discourse on this subject, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And that the main implication of that is that the body reacts to stress early in childhood in these very physiologic ways, and that when a child has asthma or signs of inflammation, that going back and listening carefully to what is that child's life story and life experience is absolutely critical, in addition to you know, inhaled steroids and all the other things that we do. So that's like spot on, exactly the point, Kelsey. Thank you. Okay, so let me go back. So I'm very ambitious in what I want to share with you. Genetics and epigenetics. So I'm going to ask one of my co-faculty to look out for hand raising. I'm just curious how many people are familiar with the term epigenetics, or if you want to put your virtual hand up, that would be great. And I'll just keep talking. And then if you want to just, anytime you have that information, shout it back to me. So epigenetics literally means above the gene. So typically we think of genes as not changing. So for example, if you have cystic fibrosis, you have a genetic defect, and nothing about the environment is going to change that genetic defect. But the fact is that the environment affects not the structure of the gene, not the base pairs, but the way in which genes are expressed. And that in turn has significant influence on the development of the brain and body, the way the genes are expressed. And those changes, which are the environment influencing expression of the gene, can be passed from one generation to the next. This is what I just said, essentially, with this nice picture. It just opens up the gene and changes the way it makes proteins. So the environment affects the way the gene works, not the structure of the gene, but what it does. And that's epigenetics. And the original research on this was done by Francis Champagne and Michael Meany, where they found that they used this term high licking and grooming. So if rat mothers did a lot of licking and grooming of their rat pups, their pups were calm as adults. But if they had low licking and grooming, they produced anxious adult rats. So it was actually literally the experience of being licked and groomed that changed the expression of their genes. And there's a lot of research on this epigenetic effect in pregnancy, which accounts for some of the effects of things like depression, where the changes to the methylation is what is the chemical process by which the gene expression is changed. And then it in turn affects the way the babies regulate themselves. Okay, so this is another example of this distinction. So ADHD is the genetics of ADHD are highly misunderstood. There is no gene for ADHD, but there are variations in genes that increase the risk of the behaviors that we call ADHD. However, those, if you grow up in an environment that's filled with conflict, you're more likely to show those behaviors. But if you have the same exact gene and you grow up in an environment without conflict, then you're not going to have the characteristics of ADHD. And this is sometimes referred to as the orchid dandelion hypothesis. So the very same gene, by this mechanism of epigenetics, can be helpful, actually a positive thing in certain environments, whereas it's a risk gene in other environments. Our bodies are constantly, continually changing gene expression in response to the environment without, as I said, changes to the DNA sequence itself. So another, example of this is some work in Wisconsin about mindfulness, actually changing gene expression that leads to faster recovery from stress. So in other words, biology is not destiny. And again, linking it to some other concepts I've talked about earlier, we can think of that mentalization or reflective functioning and mutual regulation as kind of the human equivalents of licking and grooming. So when an infant feels held, it helps the brain and stress response system develop in a healthy way at the level of expression of the genes. Okay, so this is where I now grandly try to tie all of this together. Because this idea that your ancestors can have changes to their genes that then are passed on to their offspring, first of all, a lot of it has been demonstrated in work with Holocaust survivors, and particularly the work of Rachel Yehuda, who is in this picture here. This is Rachel Yehuda lecturing to the UMass Boston program last year about her research. So a lot of our ideas about how changes to gene expression are passed down through the generations comes from her work. And this is another slide of hers, where she talks about how it is relevant not only for Holocaust survivors, but all survivors of interpersonal violence and subjugation by others. So this idea of epigenetics, and I'm going to go on to talk about what is the clinical implication of this, because it's not helpful unless we know, if we can help this situation. Because I've had people say, well, this is just terrifying to think that, something terrible happened generations ago, and then you're stuck with that in your genes. So without having, and I'm going to get to that. So how do we change that? And it's all going to come together. And I'm going to borrow from a colleague of mine who connected epigenetics in this presentation with slavery. So she talks about the specific historical trauma of slavery and post-traumatic slave syndrome, and then what that looks like in the body. And you'll see, some of these things that I've been talking about: dissociation, intense fear, low self-esteem. So what she was talking about in this presentation is that these features that actually are things that happened to people who are generations before us can still live in the present day. And then she again talks about what I've been saying, that this happens through the process of epigenetics. And this is a book that I highly recommend, which really gives a very comprehensive and vivid description of all of this. And I just love this quote. My grandmother was a strong and loving woman, but her body was frequently nervous. She often had a sense that something terrible was about to happen. It was an ancient inherited sense that rarely left her, a traumatic retention. So I think that captures how things that happened in the past kind of live in the present in our bodies. Okay, but so what do we do about that? And this is where it all, I hope, comes together. Because if we understand that our gene expression changes in response to our environment, then if we change our environment and create an environmental milieu of relationships that provide opportunity for mismatch and repair, that we can change. We can change those intergenerational patterns of inheritance, and we are not prisoners of our genes. But it's not easy, and it takes time to make these changes. So all of the different things all of the different relationships in which we find ourselves can be part of that that relational health. It doesn't have to be early, because in these situations, maybe the relational health was healthy, and then in past generations it wasn't. But the idea is that we have, in order to change the meanings we make of ourselves in the world, we need a whole lot of relationships to change our sense of self. And I was just speaking this morning again with the same supervisee about a little boy who had a lot of, ended up in foster care, a lot of early developmental trauma, and was playing soccer, and his mother, his adoptive mother, went to church. And we were talking about how those things are all part of his treatment, because they're all different ways of making meaning in relationships. So let me just stop here for a second, because I'm going to do my grand tying it all together. But I want to just, because I've talked about a lot of different things, and I want to hear from you before I go on to that section. Now, the raised hands are people who knew about epigenetics, or are these questions? Okay.
People who knew.
Okay, great. So anybody have any, I know it's a lot of information I just gave you all. I see, Kelsey, are you raising, is this a question? No, okay, still raised hand. Linda, yes.
So Claudia, help me, if I'm remembering right, wasn't the other piece of the licking rats research that they took babies that were born to licking rats and put them to non-licking rats, and when they had babies, they didn't lick their rats? And they took non-licking babies and put them with licking rats, and when they had babies, it was like, it's to me, it was the conclusion of exactly what you're saying. They changed the environment of the, because you could do generations of rats really quick.
Yeah, I think you may be right, but
That's what I thought I remembered, because that's what kind of brought it home for me. It's like, oh my goodness, look at this. I mean, here you took when a rat baby is born to a non-licking mother and they have a baby, they don't lick their rats. It's like they don't do it. They don't lick their babies. But if you take that same rat and put it with a licking mother and then they have a baby, they lick their babies.
But yeah, I can't speak exactly to that part of the experiment, but I do know that is the idea that I'm trying to get across, which is that not that these things, we are not, as Rachel Yehuda said, we're not prisoners of our genes. So even if we have, in my family, as I believe I share with you, I am the third generation Holocaust survivor. So I have had the opportunity to shift those kinds of meanings that were in my body, but it's taken a time and many different kinds of relationships to change those meanings. So let me just do the last few slides here, and then we'll hopefully have a few minutes before our guests come. Okay. So, all right, can you all see that? Yes?
Yes, yes,
Okay, great.
yeah.
I can't see you. Okay. So, I was thinking, I just about that very rich conversation that Gwendolyn and Linda had. And I've been thinking about how this idea of not knowing kind of holds together everything, believe it or not, everything we've been talking about. Because what is it that changes the meaning of ourselves in the world? It's lots of relationships where it's messy and we don't know what's going to happen, and we have this kind of sense of safety, and it's through all of those moments strung together that we come to have this more hopeful sense of ourselves in the world. So I just, I had not injected myself into that conversation because I wanted to see where you all took it, but I just want to go back to it because it just was such a rich example of everything. We use this term cultural humility, and I'm here using culture in very broadly as a common way of being in the world. And I really think that we can understand cultural humility as a way of not knowing. And it led me to think about the term bias as reflecting a kind of certainty, as opposed to really approaching a situation with a stance of not knowing. So thinking back to that beautiful story, that there was really fundamental shift in that relationship over time in a way that was very messy. And it started out with this kind of, if you don't mind me going back, this kind of assumption that because Gwendolyn's skin color being more or less the same as her client's skin color, that somehow they were going to know each other. When in fact, there was this enormous amount of time of not knowing. And it was very messy, and through that time, which was, it's not knowing in two levels, not knowing where the other person is and not really knowing what you're doing, which I think is really hard to say, okay, I'm going to admit that I don't really know what I'm doing. And it's through that our meanings of ourselves change in the world. So linking this all back together, what are we looking for if we want to change our brain? We want to change the meanings that are embedded in our genes, that we need to be immersed in situations where there is that opportunity for not knowing. So, and this really comes, in my view, from babies, because this is exactly how babies learn to make meaning of themselves in the world. They have come into the world, have no idea what's going on. And then through these moments, these messy moments, they get an idea that this is how I belong to this particular culture, but we belong to many different cultures. Again, sort of putting together the idea of repair and belonging, that we find a sense of belonging and joy in belonging through this muddling through of all these messy moments. And I just love this quote from Desmond Tutu, because it really identifies how this sense of belonging is core to our humanity. He identifies this term, which some of you may have heard, Ubuntu. It is to say a person is a person through other persons. A person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, for he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs to a greater whole. So perhaps it was a bit of a stretch to tie all of that together, but I really do feel that it's important to tie the science with what we're actually doing in our relationships with each other and with our clients. So I hope that all tied together in somewhat messy package. And I will, now we have 10 minutes before our guests arrive, and I'll just open it up for discussion. And I'm not going to record the discussion, so people are free to speak their minds.